Now, isn't that a good-looking bunch? Okay, here goes a little about me. I was born in Florida, Missouri. In 1835, the youngest of 4 children. Our family never had much money, although you'd be interested to know that, like a lot of people of our time, unfortunately, we did own slaves. In fact, if you visited the house where my family lived, you'd see a little rug by the fireplace where a slave would have slept. My father was trained as a lawyer, but he wanted to be a merchant instead. That didn't work out very well for him. Finally, he moved us to Hannibal, Missouri. And when I left Florida, I said, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Missouri." Or was it, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Missouri"? I can't remember how I exactly said that. Dad tried lawyering, being a lawyer, that is. And it was a little bit better. In fact, he was elected Justice of the Peace in Hannibal, right along the Mississippi River. Sadly, though, he died when I was only 12 years old. And our family had to scrape around a bit for the next few years. One of the ways we made ends meet was my brother Orion and I started a little newspaper there, right out the front of our house, the Hannibal Journal. I did most of the typesetting. I've always had wanderlust, and I started traveling when I was only 18, going to some big city spots I'd always hankered to see. New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and such. Sometimes I'd come back and see my folks, but then I'd always be off again. Finally, I decided to head off to Brazil, but I got waylaid by a fellow named Horace Bixby, who convinced me I might like to be a river pilot. He was right. Those were some of the happiest years of my life. First learning the ropes, and then learning that river like the back of my hand. Even wrote about it, Life on the Mississippi.
When I had mastered the language of this water and had come to know every trifling feature that bordered the great river as familiarly as I knew the letters of the alphabet, I'd made quite a valuable acquisition. I still keep in mind a certain wonderful sunset which I witnessed when steamboating was new to me.
A broad expanse of the river was turned to blood. In the middle distance, the red hue brightened into gold, through which a solitary log came floating, black and conspicuous. In one place, a long slanting mark lay upon the water. In another, the surface was broken by boiling, tumbling rings that were as many tinted as an oval.
Where the ruddy flush was faintest was a smooth spot covered with graceful circles and radiating lines, ever so delicately traced. And high above the forest wall, a clean-stemmed dead tree waved a single leafy bough that glowed like a flame in unbroken splendor that was flowing from the sun. I stood like one bewitched. I drank it in speechless rapture. The world was new to me, and I'd never seen anything like this before.
But I lost something, too. Something which could never be restored to me while I lived. All the grace, the beauty, the poetry had gone out of the majestic river. If that sunset scene had been repeated, I should have looked upon it without rapture and should have commented upon it inwardly after this fashion. This sun means that we are going to have wind tomorrow. That floating log means that the river is rising. That slanting mark refers to a bluff reed which is going to kill somebody's steamboat one of these nights.
The lines and circles in the slick water over yonder are warning that that troublesome place is a break from a new snag. That tall dead tree with a single living branch is not going to last long. And then how is a body ever going to get through this blind place at night without the friendly old landmark? No, the romance and beauty were all gone from the river. All the value any feature of it had for me now was the amount of usefulness it could furnish towards the compassing, safe piloting of a steamboat.
Since those days, I have pitied doctors from my heart. What does the lovely flush in a beauty's cheek mean to a doctor? but a break that ripples above some deadly disease? Are not all her visible charms sewn thick with what to him are the signs and symbols of hidden decay? Does he ever see her beauty at all? Or doesn't he simply view her professionally and comment upon her unwholesome condition all to himself? And doesn't he sometimes wonder whether he has gained most or lost most by learning his trade?
I spent about 4 years as a river pilot. It was good indeed. After I left the river, my brother and I decided to try mining for a while. We made a little money, but not much. Most important, though, I kept learning about writing, finding the right word to describe what I had experienced. The difference between almost the right word and the right word is a large matter. It's the difference between a lightning bug and the lightning. I started sending some little pieces to the Enterprise newspaper in Virginia City, Nevada. This was when I found out I could make money writing. A fellow named Joseph T. Goodman hired me for $25 a week as an editor. Around that time, I began to use the name Mark Twain, which was kind of tied to my river pilot experience. Mark Twain just means 2 fathoms of water. My friends all started calling me that, and pretty soon Samuel Clemens was just sort of forgotten. Finally, I moved to San Francisco and wrote for several newspapers, including the Sacramento Union. Then I did some more touring, even going overseas for a while. I'm not sure what I learned, what I was supposed to with this traveling, but it gave me some things to write about, especially in a book I wrote called Innocents Abroad, where I described the art of Venice. I loved Venice. It's all water, you know.
We have seen famous pictures until our eyes are weary with looking at them and refuse to find interest in them any longer. And what wonder when there are 1,200 pictures by Palma the Younger in Venice and 1,500 by Tintoretto. And behold, there are Titians and the work of other artists in proportion. I may therefore as well acknowledge, with such apology as is may be due, that to me it seemed that when I had seen one of those pictures of martyrs, I had seen them all.
They all have a marked family resemblance to each other. They dress alike in coarse monkish robes and sandals. They're all bald-headed. They stand in about the same attitude. Without exception, they're gazing heavenly with countenance which I've been told is full of expression. To me, there's nothing I can grasp or take interest in.
We also saw in Milan an autographed letter of Lucretia Borgia, a lady for whom I have always entertained the highest respect on account of her rare histrionic capabilities, her opulence in solid gold goblets made of gilded wood, her high distinction as an operatic screamer, and the facility with which she could order a sextuple funeral and get the corpses ready for it. We saw one single coarse yellow hair from Lucretia's head. Likewise, it awoke emotions, but we still live.
In the same library, we saw some drawings by Michelangelo. These same Italians call him Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. They spell it Vinci and pronounce it Vinci. Foreigners always spell better than they pronounce. We reserve our opinion of those sketches.
Sometimes folks got a little offended when I didn't take my travels too seriously, but mostly they realized I was just having fun and not taking life too seriously. One thing did happen during the travels, though, it was pretty damn serious. I met a fellow on a ship one time, just a young fellow about 18 years old, Charles Langdon. His father was a rich coal mine owner from Elmira, New York. And Charles introduced me to his sister, Olivia. She was so pretty and so sweet. Her father didn't take to me right away. I wonder why. I was not very refined cuss, and their family were abolitionists. But I was pretty determined when it came to courting, and I was willing to grow about the slavery. He finally came around, and Olivia and I were married in 1870. Oh, I was awful happy with Olivia. I started thinking about the first love of all time in the Garden of Eden between Adam and Eve, and thinking about my wife. I said, wherever she was, there was Eden. I imagined what Eve must have been thinking about when she saw Adam for the first time. And I wrote about that in Eve's diary. I can still imagine Eve there, writing in her diary.
I followed the other experiment around yesterday afternoon, at a distance, to see what it might be for, but I was not able to make out. I think it is a man. I had never seen a man, but it looked like one, and I feel sure that is what it is. I feel more curiosity about it than any of the other creatures. It has frowsy hair and blue eyes. It has no hips. It tapers like a carrot. When it stands, it spreads itself apart like a derrick. All the week I tagged around after him and tried to get acquainted. I had to do the talking because he was shy, but I didn't mind. He seemed pleased to have me around.
It has low taste, though, and is not kind. When I went there yesterday in the gloaming, it had crept down and was trying to catch the little speckled fishes that play in the pool. I had to clod it to make it go up the tree again and let him alone. Hasn't it any heart? Hasn't it any compassion for these little creatures? Can it be that it was designed and manufactured for such ungentle work? One of the clods took it back of the ear, and it used language. It gave me a thrill, for it was the first time I'd ever heard speech except my own. I did not understand the words, but they seemed expressive.
We are getting along very well indeed, and getting better and better acquainted. He does not try to avoid me anymore, which is a good sign, and shows that he likes to have me with him.
During the last day or two, I have taken all the work of naming things off his hands, and this has been a great relief for him, for he has not gift in that line, and is evidently very grateful. He can't think of a rational name to save him, but I do not let him see that I am aware of his defect. Whenever a new creature comes along, I name it before he has time to expose himself by an awkward silence. In this way, I have saved him many embarrassments.
My first sorrow. Yesterday he avoided me and seemed to wish I would not talk to him. I could not believe it and thought there was some mistake, for I loved to be with him and loved to hear him talk. And so how could it be that he would feel unkind toward me when I had not done anything? I went away and sat lonely in the place where I first saw him, the morning that we were made. Now it was a mournful place, and every little thing spoke of him, and my heart was very sore.
It is pleasant again now, and I am happy. But those were heavy days. I do not think of them when I can help it. I tried to get him some of those apples, but I cannot learn to throw straight. I failed, but I think the good intention pleased him. They are forbidden, and he says I shall come to harm. But so I come to harm through pleasing him. Why shall I care for that harm?
He loves me as well he can. I love him with all the strength of my passionate nature, and this, I think, is proper to my youth and sex. If I ask myself why I love him, I find I do not know, and do not really care to know. So I suppose that kind of love is not a product of reasoning and statistics. Yes, I think I love him merely because he is mine and is masculine.
It is my prayer, it is my longing that we may pass from this life together, a longing which shall never perish from the earth, but shall have place in the heart of every wife that loves, until the end of time.
This prayer is also immortal, and will not cease from being offered up while my race continues.
I am the first wife, and in the last wife I shall be repeated.
Excuse me. Yes. Those early years with Olivia and later with the 3 girls, that was Eden indeed. Started out living in Buffalo, New York, and then moved to Hartford, Connecticut, and lived there 17 years. And not only my personal life, but my writing career was just great. It was during that time I wrote the books about those young lads, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Good kids, yeah, but kids who sometimes got into mischief. I wonder how many people noticed, though, that those books were not just amusing little adventure tales. Thanks to Olivia and her family and some other experiences, I was really starting to think about some pretty serious stuff. Huck Finn, for example, is just a runaway kid getting away from something he didn't like about where he lived and the people he knew. But somehow he ended up on a river, on a raft, with a black slave named Jim. They ran into a lot of unsavory characters and handled things pretty well as they went down that river. I guess you could say this was an initiation story. I mean that by simply saying Huck was learning about being a man. I'll warn you here a little bit about Huck's language, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. I was trying to be realistic. He uses a word that I'm sure you would never use. But it isn't our word, it's Huck's. He's just a product of his time, and he's heard that word all his life. I think the fact that he uses it illustrates his struggle. He's trying to choose between what he's always been taught about right and wrong, and just what he comes to know in his heart from his experience with Jim on the river in my book, Huckleberry Finn.
I couldn't get that out of my conscience. No way, no how. It got to trouble me so I couldn't rest. Couldn't stay still in one place. It had never come home to me before, this thing that I was doing. But now it did, and it stayed with me. It scorched me more and more. I tried to make out to myself that I weren't to blame because I didn't run Jim off from his rightful owner, but it weren't no use. Consciousness up and says every time, but you knowed he was running for his freedom, and you could have paddled ashore and told somebody. That's where it pinched. Conscience says to me, what had poor Miss Watson done to you, that you could see her nigger go off right under your eyes and never say one single word? What did that poor old woman do to you that treated her so mean?
Jim talked out loud all the time while I was talking to myself. He was saying how the first thing he would do when he got to a free state, he would go up saving his money and never spend a single cent. And when he got enough, he would buy his wife, which was owned on a farm close to where Ms. Watson lived. And then they would both work to buy the 2 children. And if their master wouldn't sell them, they'd get an abolitionist to go and steal them. It almost froze me to hear such talk.
So I was full of trouble, full as I could be, and didn't know what to do. At last I had an idea, and I says, I'll go and write a letter to Miss Watson. Why, it was astonishing the way I felt, as light as a feather, right straight off, and all my troubles all gone. So I got a piece of paper and a pencil, all glad and excited, and sat down and wrote, Ms. Watson, your runaway nigger Jim is down here 2 miles below Pikesville, and Mr. Phelps has got him, and he will give him up for the reward if you send. Huck Finn. I felt good and washed clean of sin for the first time I'd ever felt so in my life, and I knew I could pray now. But I didn't do it straight off, but laid the paper down and sat here thinking how good it was all this happened so, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell.
But I went on thinking, and got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me all the time, in the day and in the nighttime, sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we were floating along, talking and singing and laughing. Somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him, but only the other kind.
I'd see him standing my watch on top of his, instead of calling me, so I could go on sleeping. And see him how glad he was when I'd come back out of the fog, and when I come home to him again in the swamp. He'd do everything he could think of for me. How good he always was. And at last, I stuck the time I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard. He was so grateful. He said I was the best friend he ever had in the world, and the only one who's got it now.
Then I happened to look around to see that paper. I took it up and I held it in my hand. I was trembling because I got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then I says to myself,
All right then, I'll go to hell.
and I let those words stay said, and never thought no more about reforming.
It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said.
I shoved the whole thing out of my head. I said I weren't to take up wickedness again, which was in my line, being brought up to it. But the other weren't.
And for a starter, I'd steal Jim out of slavery again, and if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too.
Because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog.
Now, those books about Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn did okay. In fact, I was getting to be pretty famous. How many of you out there read anything about Huck Finn when you were in school? I'm so pleased. You see, in fact, it got started that a lot of folks started quoting me, especially my one-liners.
Adam and Eve had many advantages, but the principal one was that they escaped teething.
Familiarity breeds contempt. And children.
Be good and you will be lonesome.
If you pick up a starving dog and make him prosperous, he will not bite you. That is the main difference between a dog and a man.
Thunder is good. Thunder is impressive. But it is the lightning that does the work.
I didn't attend the funeral, but I sent a nice letter saying I approve of it.
I think that there is a single specialty with us Americans, only one thing that can be called by the wide name American. That is the national devotion to ice water.
A classic is a book which people praise and do not read.
There ain't no way to find out why a snorer can't hear himself snore.
When angry, count to 4. When very angry, swear.
It takes your enemy and your friend working together to hurt you to the heart. The one to slander you and the other to get the news to you.
Man is the only animal that blushes, or needs to.
Why, that's some darn good writing, if you ask me. One you left out. Man is the only one with the true religion. Several of them. Good times. Well, it was good times for a long time. I guess you have heard that I was kind of a sour fellow toward the end of my life, and for good reason. I think I had the same bad luck as my country, and money became a problem for a lot of us around the 1890s. My private publishing house went bankrupt, and I'd fooled around with a fancy typesetting machine that didn't prove to work out very well. The main thing, though, was the personal stuff. My darling daughter, Susie, died of meningitis. The worst blow of my life. My dear Livy, my lovely wife, who had been in such poor health for a long time, finally let go in 1904. Oh, how I wish that I was with Livy. She was my riches, and I was a pauper without her. Then my last sadness, my daughter Jean died just 5 years later. I have one wonderful memory of what was left of my family. My last daughter, Clara, was married at home to a good man. But all these losses, people I loved struggling for money, eventually took their toll. Everyone is a moon and has a dark side, which he never shows to anybody. Well, I began to show my dark side. and some of my stuff was a little bitter at the end. I still thought it was funny in its own way, but it seemed I just had to make fun of people who were self-righteous and hypocritical. Even little boy who was trying to be good became one of my targets, and I wrote the story of a good little boy.
Once, there was a good little boy by the name of Jacob Blivens. He always obeyed his parents, no matter how absurd and unreasonable their demands were. And he always learned his book and never was late at Sabbath school. He would not play hooky even when his sober judgment told him that it was the most profitable thing he could do. None of the other boys could ever make that boy out. He acted so strangely. He wouldn't lie, no matter how convenient it was. He was so honest that he was simply ridiculous.
Now, did that little boy get a reward for being good? Not in my book.
One thing that Jacob wanted to do was to find a lame dog that hadn't any place to stay and was hungry and persecuted, and bring him home and pet him and have that dog's imperishable gratitude. And at last he found one and was happy. And he brought him home and fed him. But when he was going to pet him, the dog flew at him and tore all the clothes off him, except those that were in the front, and made a spectacle of him that was astonishing.
On and on, no matter how hard that boy tried to be the perfect child and earn a reward in gratitude, it just didn't work.
Once, when he was on his way to Sunday school, he saw some bad boys starting off pleasuring in a sailboat. He was filled with consternation because he knew from his reading that boys who went sailing on Sunday invariably got drowned. So he ran out to a raft to warn them. But a log turned with him and slid him into the river. A man got him out pretty soon, and the doctor pumped the water out of him. But he caught cold and lay abed 9 weeks.
Whatever this boy did, he got into trouble. But the most unaccountable thing about it was that the bad boys in the boat had a good time all day, and then reached home alive and well in the most surprising manner.
Maybe I was just trying to show that life wasn't fair. And it's a mistake to believe that you are so good that everything is going to turn out to your advantage. In fact, at one time I wrote a story about a whole town, Hadleyburg, that was too proud of itself. The story was The Man Who Corrupted Hadleyburg.
It was many years ago. Hadleyburg had the most honest and upright town in all the region about. It had kept that reputation unsmirched during 3 generations and was prouder of it than any of its other possessions. It was so proud of it and so anxious to ensure its perpetuation that it began to teach principles of honest dealings to babies in the cradle, and made the like teachings the staples of their culture henceforward through all the years devoted to their children.
The neighboring towns were jealous of this honorable supremacy and affected to sneer at Hadleyburg's pride in it and call it vanity. But all the same, they were obliged to acknowledge that Hadleyburg was in reality an incorruptible town.
If pressed, they would also acknowledge that the mere fact a young man hailed from Hadleyburg was all the recommendation he needed when he went forth from his natal town to seek for responsible employment.
Oh, sorry. Well, you can guess what happened. I introduced a sneaky character into the town of Hadleyburg, somebody that had a grudge against one of the folks in the town, and he brought a bag of gold. If you ain't read the story, you're going to know what's happened anyway. It turned out that pretty soon all those righteous folks were thinking about all that gold and suspecting one another and lying and gossiping to an awful degree. Hadleyburg became just like any other town, not exactly a perfect place to live. In fact, I even poked fun at heaven itself. I couldn't believe that folks would be content to spend their time singing and waving palms and wearing halos all day. In my story called Captain Stormfield Visiting Heaven, I told the captain, I had the captain notice that everyone in heaven was starting to pile up all that stuff and forgot about it. And he noticed heaven wasn't so perfect after all. The one thing that humans enjoy most of all, a little romance once in a while, didn't even exist in heaven. I think the thing I most got her hepped up about, although it's something I saw in some religious folks. So sanctimonious, so hypocritical. I guess I tried to just get people to see themselves a little more honestly, a little more clearly. I know, I got downright bitter at the end. Not like some of the fun I once had with my writing in earlier times. But I never tried to lie. When in doubt, tell the truth, I always say. Sometimes the truth is pretty funny. Sometimes it gets pretty angry. I tried not to stay angry and to stick to the truth. I still had some good laughs too, though. Once in New York, in the New York Journal, published an article that I died. That was 1897. And even though I was starting to get a little grumpy, I was also pretty perky. I sent him a note saying the report of my death was an exaggeration. In fact, I lasted 13 more years. I guess all in all, my life was okay. But eventually, I had to take the universal path that we all have to take.
While playing golf in Bermuda with Woodrow Wilson in early 1910, Mark Twain suffered an attack of angina. He decided to return to the United States, saying during the 2-day journey home, "It's a losing race. No ship can outsail death." 10 days later, he died peacefully in his sleep on a beautiful spring day, April 21st, 1910.
The delight that Twain brought to his audiences and his readers during his lifetime is very much alive today. Not only are Mark Twain's writings a staple in school assignments all across the globe, they are present in thousands of the personal libraries of those who love a witty phrase, a discerning insight, and a penetrating journey into the human heart.
He has been honored with literary degrees from Oxford University, as well as universities all across the United States.
We honor him today for the cheer and comfort he brought to the world with his wisdom and humor, but also for making us think, for his continual warfare on oppression, superstition, and sham. His words, his wonderful words, are still with us.
One of the striking differences between a cat and a lie is that a cat has only 9 lives.
Fewer things are harder to put up with than the annoyance of a good example.
Always do right. That will gratify some people and astonish the rest.
Clothes make the man. Naked people have little or no influence on society.
Truth is the most valuable thing we have. Let us economize it.
Wrinkles should merely indicate where smiles have been.
If you don't read the newspaper, you'll be uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you'll be misinformed.